I'm glad to see so many people here who have an interest in this topic because it's something that's very near and dear to my heart. He has already mentioned a few of these things about me being, he didn't say the words obsessively writing, but it is true. That's what I do. And the presidency of the AEA was one where I first used the words transforming society through evaluation. And my work as editor of the Journal of Mixed Methods Research. If you've edited a journal, you know you get to see the full spectrum of how this methodology evolves over the course of time. So that was a difficult but very interesting thing. Now, to stop down with the last bullet, Professor Emeritus at Gallaudet, it is a university for deaf people. And so when I would enter campus, I would need to just turn off my voice and start using American Sign Language. And at the time that I got there, I had never actually met a deaf person. And so you might be going, well, why the heck would you go there? Because all my work up to that point had been about marginalized populations. And so it could have been women in the workforce or people with disabilities, people in isolated rural areas, people in prisons, so forth and so on. But I had never lived with those communities. It had always been something I did from a distance. I just felt very strongly that what was missing was that opportunity to really engage with members of a marginalized community and to find out how, as a methodologist, which is what I am, I could be of service to that population. And so when I got there, I really thought that I knew a lot about methodology because I'd had other jobs before. I'd been a coordinator of research and evaluation at College of Medicine. I'd been a research scientist at Ohio State, all these other different positions, but I had never been involved and engaged with. And so when I started to teach, and my students, members of visual language, would just kind of roll their eyes back or look down or look over here. And so, sometimes students do that anyway. But I asked them, what's going on? And I'm going to really encapsulate very short version of what they said is that what you have to understand, Dr. Mertens, is that research and evaluation have never been anything but an instrument of oppression that has excluded us or misrepresented us or characterized us in very negative ways. And that's why we don't like it. Well, that made sense. So I said, well, what do we have to do now? And that really is the origins of the transformative paradigm. But as I began working to be a better methodologist, to work with the deaf community, I couldn't help but recognize it as a very heterogeneous community. They come with all different genders, all different sexual identities, all different races, all different countries of origin, different home languages, different poverty levels, and so forth and so on. And so one thing to just look at, how do we confront discrimination as an ethical principle as a part of our evaluation and research practice, wasn't going to be enough. It needed to have that umbrella that could incorporate whatever dimension of diversity was being used as a basis of discrimination. And sometimes we hear that talked about as intersectionality, that if we're looking at issues of indigeneity, for example, we are inclusive of women, people with disabilities, and so forth. And so that was really why I began work on the development of a framework for understanding better how, as methodologists, we can be of service to people who experience discrimination on whatever basis it is. And so from that, I developed a transformative approach. And just this again is just kind of a nutshell because I'm going to give you a little bit more detail, but at least you'll have some framework in your mind to, if you haven't read things about this, that it is very conscious that the context in which we do our work has power relations that are important. And sometimes those power relations have equity associated with them, and sometimes inequity, and sometimes it's formal power that we're looking at, and sometimes it's informal power. But if we don't look at that, then we're not going to be able to structure and design our studies in ways that would fulfill the assumptions of transformation in pursuit of human rights and social justice. And so the focus is to identify the structural causes of inequality and discrimination, and to determine the impact of programs on impoverished people or other groups that are facing discrimination through participatory and reflective processes, with the aim to progress towards a greater realization of human rights and gender equity. So that's a real nutshell of what I mean by transformative mixed methods. Now, as I began to try to figure all this out, I was like, well, let's see. We have feminists who are talking about using qualitative methods and lived experience and so forth, but it's got to be bigger than that. And what was so really serendipitously wonderful for me was that I entered the evaluation field about the time that Egon Guba and Ivana Lincoln were putting out what I consider to be really a landmark framework for understanding methodological decisions. Because at that moment in time, it was known as the paradigm wars, where people who wanted to do quantitative thought they were doing the best, and people who wanted to do qualitative thought they were doing the best. And when we say war, there was a lot of acrimonious language of people saying that, you know, what you're doing isn't going to get us to the right place. No, I'm doing it. Stuff like that. And then Egon Guba and Ivana Lincoln said, well, wait a minute. We don't think that the argument really is about quant or qual. We think it's about the assumptions that guide your methodological decisions. And so they characterize these frameworks or paradigms by 4 different types of assumptions. One, the axiological, about the nature of ethics and values. Ontological, the nature of reality. Is there one reality we go out and measure? Are there multiple realities? That kind of question. Epistemologically, how do we as researchers or evaluators relate to the people that we are engaging with in our studies, and whose knowledge is being given priority, whose knowledge is being valued? Those are the epistemological questions. And when we filter through answers to those questions, then it leads us to making different kinds of decisions about the nature of systematic inquiry, the methodological assumption. So this is kind of quickly about what's the transformative paradigm. Well, you'll see the set of assumptions: axiology, ontology, epistemology, methodology. And what I'm really going to focus on today are those axiological assumptions associated with the transformative paradigm. In other words, when you use a transformative paradigm, what are the qualities that you are holding to say this is a piece of ethical work? And I would begin by saying cultural responsiveness. If we're doing ethical work, we are culturally responsive. And there's a whole body of literature now that's emerged using the words culturally responsive. And it is insightful. It's a lot of younger people who are coming forward and saying, hey, you know, this is what my culture means. This is what I think you should do in my community to be responsive. And so it's a very exciting time to be exploring that aspect of ethics. Designing our studies so that it's not just an answer to a question, but designing them in ways that actually promote social, environmental, and economic justice and human rights. And that we consciously address those inequities, that we look for opportunities for reciprocity, meaning that we give back to the communities that we are engaging in with for our research. that is not necessarily something where you say, when I first started studying methodology books, it would say things like, well, give them a coupon to a fast food restaurant or something. Well, now we know almost all fast food restaurants are unhealthy for you, so it's not a very good suggestion anyway. But what if instead the reciprocity is capacity building? If it's organizational structure, if it's a way to provide for meaningful input into the study itself and into the sustainability of the results for that study. What a strong, powerful way to conceptualize reciprocity. And that includes looking at the resilience within these communities. So instead of saying, oh, they're the poor people, oh, the victims, oh, this, oh, that, look at people who are surviving in adverse contexts, the strength that it takes to do that. To me, that's the resilience that we need to recognize and bring into the work that we do with communities. And recognizing this, not just the people, but it's the whole environment around us that we need to be giving consideration to. So if we use those principles to talk about the meaning of doing ethical work, then it leads us to a different concept of the nature of reality. We look at whose reality is being given privilege. What are the consequences of giving privilege to that version of reality? And we can, there are a jillion examples of that. But right now in the United States, white supremacy is reigning supreme in the government of the state of Florida. And their version of reality is that slavery was good for the Black people, that they learned skills that were useful to them. That is a version of reality that comes from a position of privilege for a white male governor. But consequences of accepting that is ignoring the horror of slavery and the subsequent legacy of discrimination against people of color. And so that's just a real quick example of what difference does it make, whose knowledge you give priority to, and how you interpret that. Epistemologically, it means we need to take that time to build relationships, to be interactive, to find out what it means, to have trust, to build coalitions so that people can have that meaningful input and they can be a part of the sustainability process. And that then leads us to our methodological decisions, which for me largely have involved the use of mixed methods because of the complexity of the issues, borrowing from the literature on being culturally responsive and being aware of the need to have policymakers involved so that we can influence policy change. All right, so now, I said this was going to be my focus, and so it will be, but I wanted to give you just a little context to put all of this into. The focus is on the methodological assumptions associated with building culturally responsive relationships, supporting an increase in justice in social, economic, and environmental, addressing those inequities and challenging discriminations, adopting strategies to foster capacity and coalition building, and addressing power inequities and planning for sustainability. So why do I talk about socioeconomic and environmental justice? Because I did work in Indonesia, in which the government decided that economic development was necessary, and they had a good basis for that because there's high poverty, people were being displaced from rural areas, they were being trafficked, there was a lot of problems with illegal activities because of no solid economic base. So they said, you know what, let's just build a textile factory because that's economic development. But then that textile factory poisoned the river next to it. And that was where the people got their water for drinking and bathing and everything else. And so right there, if you look at why they didn't consider socioeconomic and environmental justice and what the consequences of that were, it's terrible. Okay, so methodologically, where does that take us? Beginning with relationship building and contextual analysis, these are the two areas that I'm going to focus on. And you'll see the two-way arrows because you don't just form a relationship and then go on with your study. There's a constant renewal of that relationship. So here's an example of a study that I conducted in a court system in Oregon, in the state of Oregon. And what I think it really exemplifies is how you can prioritize the development of culturally responsive relationships through looking at contextual factors and the different versions of reality that define the nature of drug addiction. And this is based in the US, so it will look at the history, the dimensions of diversity that are used as a basis for discrimination, legislation, and policies. So in this particular court system, people who were arrested for drug-related offenses and had a mental illness could go into what's called a diversion program. And the diversion program meant that they didn't have to go to jail as long as they complied with a set of activities that were individually designed for them to give them the support they needed to get healthy, find a healthy place, and have a healthy life. In the context of this, what had happened in the United States is that we had federal policy that was literally called war on drugs, and they viewed this drug addiction problem as a criminal offense rather than a public health problem. The result of that was that there were very severe sentences with higher levels of policing in communities of color, so that now our prisons are filled with disproportionately large numbers of Black people who were arrested on drug offenses. This new legislation that allowed for diversion programs is one that allows us to use a different version of reality, that it's a public health problem, and that if we can build the proper relationships in the justice system with mental health providers, with the social support system, with the people and their families, that then there is no need to fill the prisons with people who have an illness. So they went through this process. I was able to collect data by observing in the courtroom, by observing the team meetings that they had, with interviewing the judge, who in full transparency is my sister. So she was a judge in the Oregon justice system. And that what they figured out was that they were doing good overall, but there were certain groups, and this is where the transformative, what's the basis of discrimination? What needs to be brought to this to really create change? They weren't doing great with persons with disabilities, with members of sexual minorities, or with veterans, especially those veterans who are suffering from PTSD. And so they took the information and they fed it back into their intervention and said, what do we need to do now differently to create the circumstances that are supportive for these subgroups that are being left behind? Okay, so the data that was collected were quantitative uptake of services and recidivism. Did the people stay out of jail? Qualitatively, content analysis, observations, and interviews. And so from this, I hope you're getting a sense that if we want to be contributors to an increase in justice, then we need to look at these contextual factors, the history of the legislation, what are the barriers, what's structurally there that's keeping an oppressive system in place, and then what needs to change, and build those relationships so that they support the change. A second item that I talked about as being related to improving our ability to have an impact in an ethical way is through the building of coalitions. Now, this is something that it's not commonly done. It's not frequently done, but some agencies, funding agencies, require them. Like I've been consulting with a group called Healthy Start, which is to decrease maternal and infant mortality in communities of color, which in the United States, it's 3 times higher for people of color than it is for white people. And it's been that way for decades. So if you continue to do the same things and don't change the way you do them, I don't know why you expect to see a change in those numbers. So what they did was require every project to have a community-based coalition that could interact with their research team and give them ideas about what needed to change. And that's when they discovered me and said, oh gosh, maybe just collecting these statistics year after year is not going to make the change that we need. Maybe we need to look at the culture. Maybe we need to look at structural restrictions. Maybe we need to look at the experiences of discrimination. And so those coalitions were able to influence the methodology and be there in place for when the study ended to carry on, to sustain change. Okay, so my argument is that we ought to at least give some consideration to building these kinds of coalitions because they can be very powerful in helping us do a better job and in creating the kind of change that is needed. This is one example that comes not at all from the research world, it comes from social activism, but I really like it because I work a lot in international development. And they say their goal is the eradication of poverty. Well, that means people have to make more money, right? And we do all these kinds of things to help people make more money. But here's something that's happened in the United States that's actually positive. People who worked in fast food restaurants got paid a minimum wage of like $7 an hour. And that was true for decades. It didn't change. And it was under the version of reality that it's just kids like in high school trying to make pocket money. But actually, when you look at the data there, it's families trying to support themselves, and they can't do it on that level of pay. They have to have 2 or 3 jobs to support their families. And so there was a union that said, you know, we'd like to see if we could be a part of improving the pay process for these fast food workers. And so they went out and they started talking to people, but people were kind of like, I'm not sure about unions. And so instead of pushing the union, what they did was go find a grassroots organization that said, look, we're not going to talk to you about joining the union, but we'll share with you some of the tactics that can be used for you to advocate for higher pay for yourself. And so at one point in that process, workers at 2 fast food restaurants in New York City said, well, let's go on a strike for a day. They weren't unionized, but they're going to go out for a strike for a day in Madison Square Garden and Times Square. If you know New York City, you know those are heavily populated areas, and it got a lot of attention. It got picked up on social media, on Twitter, which is now X, Facebook. The press was there. Then the churches wanted to get involved, ministers, rabbis, then the government officials all are like, oh yeah, we should be behind this. And then they got into some of the racially based and ethnically based advocacy organizations, the Poor People's Campaign. And now, after that process started, we now have in 20 states legislation that says minimum wage will be $20 an hour. And even the federal government has now jumped in on this. So those things could we bring into our work? Do we think, I don't know about having people go out on strike, but, you know, do we use the social media effectively? Do we bring in people from the religious community, from the government, from advocacy organizations in ways that they know because they're social advocates? Let me move on to another example. And this one kind of combines a lot of the things that I was talking about. This is an example of work that was done by Robin Miller, which some of you may know. I know Stuart Donaldson's there, and he and I nominated her for an award that she won this year for this kind of work. But she was trying to improve health services for gay and bisexual men and transgender women in countries where it's illegal to be like that. They went into the countries and they worked with an advocacy organization and with other identity organizations to say, what's the best way for us to proceed here? So rather than coming in and saying, you know, I'm the expert, I know what your problem is, I know what the solution is, they said, what is it that you can bring to us? And each of those organizations nominated people to become part of the research and evaluation team to inform the process. And by doing that, then they were providing for more equitable power relations. They did a contextual analysis. They reviewed the legislation that criminalized this behavior. They interviewed people about their experiences in the community so that they would have a better picture about what was going on. And then when it came to data collection, it was the people from these advocacy and identity organizations who said, look, we're going to be visiting a bunch of health clinics to gather data. And what we want to do is go there as mystery shoppers. Now, actually, that's not something that I would have thought of, but it was their idea that they could go in. And then they said, different people are going to go to different clinics. We want to have something that's kind of standardized that when we leave, we can compare the data across these clinics. So we want to have a quantitative checklist. Okay, maybe not the first thing I would think of either, but we want to make sure this checklist reflects things of importance to us. And so the evaluation research team could help facilitate the development of that quantitative checklist. But the whole reason that it is as it is because it's based on those equitable power relationships and valuing the knowledge of the members of the community. It was very action oriented, and they paid attention to these people who were out there collecting data as human beings. Let me show you what it would look like as a design for a study. And this is my depiction of what went on in this study. I created this based on the publications that Robin Miller and her colleagues have done. So having that relationship building phase where they're working together with collaborative agencies, activist agencies, experts, and identity groups, the contextual analysis with legislation, documenting the violence that the community experienced, and interviews to get more detailed contextual information, then to the evaluation of services, training the data collectors, developing that standardized tool. And then rather than what happens sometimes, we send people out to collect data, they come back, and then we analyze all of it. They had meetings with the people who'd been out collecting the data, and they said, well, really, these are kind of debriefing. We want to know what data you collected. But it turned out that these data collectors said, look, this is highly stressful. It's actually making us sicker to go in and collect this data. And so instead of saying, well, all right, then we'll fire you and hire someone else, they said, no, what we need to do, instead of treating this as data debriefing, we need to treat it as support sessions and provide them with the support they need. Give them some training in how to deal in context of adversity, what to say when somebody says something to you that's really insulting, and then training more data collectors so the burden wasn't so heavy on a few data collectors. So that was a really important part of the process, to change over from data debriefing to support meetings, and then collecting data more through observations and interviews and focus groups as we think about. All right, so I think you can see that there's transformative use that's happening before you get to phase 4 because of how the data got collected and how the data instruments got developed. But there was also then the use of that for developing training materials, some for the health clinic and some for people in the advocacy organizations. One of the advocacy organizations said, you know what, now we want to open a clinic here in our organization. So that was a big change. And then the facilities made action plans of how they could improve their services to this population. They set up a WhatsApp group, so if things came up that they didn't know how to deal with, they could get in touch with each other and try to figure things out. They got requests from other organizations, even from the prisons, saying, is there something that we can do that's similar to what you did? And so I think what it's showing is that if we take seriously these assumptions that really undergird methodological decisions, the axiological assumptions that we need to build these culturally responsive relationships, and pay attention to the power inequities and the bases of discrimination and engage in meaningful participatory ways that we can change the outcomes of our studies to have a more just world. So I just ask you a couple questions. Some projects include the use of a coalition or community advisory groups. When you do your work, do you engage members of groups in your projects, and how do you do it? If not, what would have to change so that you could do it? And what strategies do you think would be useful to bring a transformative lens into coalition building in service to research and evaluation? Okay, this is the last example. I really like this example because this was an example that was done in Pakistan, and it was an economic development project for women who work from home. One of the key things was that the evaluators themselves were from Pakistan. That doesn't always happen in UN-sponsored evaluations. These evaluators interacted with the UN staff and funders, but because they were from Pakistan, they were aware of the characteristics of women who work from home. And they knew that in that culture, there's stigma attached to having a member of your family with a disability. And so they knew that they needed to build relationships with the women with disabilities in order to be inclusive of this group of women. They were also looking at women who lived in poverty and trans women, which I think is really interesting that they included that as a subgroup of women. But, when you stop and think about it, there's also stigma attached in Pakistan to being a trans woman. And so the safety would be in working from home rather than going out into society. And so they did their contextual analysis that confirmed that the women with disabilities were homebound, that the trans women were experiencing stigma and discrimination. They went about their study using mixed methods, rights-based, gender-responsive strategies, looking at the structural barriers and social norms. But the data collection itself for non-disabled, non-trans women were to come in and be interviewed, to do focus groups and so forth. And what they found was that that was not going to work for the women with disabilities. And sadly, they were unable to get a group of trans women to interact with them. They were able to conduct one interview with one trans woman. So it just shows you that, you need to put that extra effort in. It's not easy. You won't always succeed, but if you don't do it, you absolutely won't succeed. But what they found was that they could modify the intervention so that these women who had never left their homes could meet together in their villages with a family support person to get the economic training that they were supposed to be getting. And that some of those women reported that this was the first time they ever left their homes. So to me, that kind of transformative change just kind of gives me goosebumps. And so they did use this information to change their approach for the intervention and for the data collection. Okay, so all of this comes to what? We're trying to have interventions that are culturally responsive and transformative. And my argument is that if we use this approach, we'll ask different kinds of questions, we'll try to be innovative, because we're looking at really complex problems that have been with us for a long time. If we focus on that relationship building with policymakers, because we need policy changers and members of marginalized communities, we have a better chance of sustainability, but also a little caution that I can never promise people that transformative change will happen, because it's not in my power to do that. My only power is to say that I will work with you, and that I will use this lens in my approach with you, and that we together will see if we can create this kind of change. Okay, so final words, it's not easy, it takes courage. I like mixed methods. I think it helps capture that complexity, address just issues of justice and ethics, the use of teams of researchers, evaluators, coalitions, and really taking seriously this idea of capacity building. I write books. I do. I have 2 books. One came out in 2023, Mixed Methods Research, in 2024. I know 2024 isn't here yet, but it's already being sold by Sage, is the 6th edition of Research and Evaluation and Psych. So yeah, I keep writing. When you do get the recording, you'll see that there's some resources. I keep a website called Transformative Research and Evaluation.com, the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation Assessment. And because I'm in the US, the AEA has lots of topical interest groups. I know that the Canadian Evaluation Society also has lots of resources. So I'm going to end with this and just ask you, what do you think you might do differently as a result of having engaged with these ideas in this session? Because Eleanor Roosevelt, who's one of my great models, said, somebody asked her, what's it going to take for us to have world peace? And she said, well, it won't be the work of one nation or one country or one person. It'll take all of us working together. And so that's kind of something that I hold on to. It's my little mantra. It takes all of us working together. If you don't get a chance or don't think of your question right away, I'm interested in making contacts with people who want to do this kind of work. So I give you my email address and post my website.